John Williamson is going to be chairing our authors session this afternoon. John was first elected to the House of Commons in May of 2011 and represents the New Brunswick riding of New Brunswick Southwest. I had occasion to be there this last fall, and it is indeed a beautiful part of this country. Before entering politics, John was an editorial writer at the National Post and a member of the newspaper's editorial board. Subsequently, he worked as the National Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and was also the Director of Communications to the Prime Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome John Williamson.
Thanks, Dave. Well, good afternoon. I hope everyone's doing well today. I'm going to be pretty brief here just because I'm hoping to hear from the authors on the stage, and then if we have time afterwards to take some questions from you all about some of the books we're going to hear. This is actually kind of important, I think, in terms of to understand both what authors bring to life, and you can go back over the decades, and whether it's novels, The Discipline of Power, One-Eyed Kings, and just a whole series of them. What these books serve to do is often to kind of bring alive or to reveal what's happening in Ottawa or wherever the authors choose to write on, and to give Canadians and readers a better sense of what's happening behind the closed doors in the halls, or in the case of some of the authors today, to reveal perhaps some of the thinkings of some of our political leaders. So let me kind of go through and just briefly introduce our assembled guests here. A senior columnist for Maclean's magazine, Paul Wells, is one of Canada's most insightful political commentators. He's the author of Right Side Up, The Fall of Paul Martin, and the Rise of Stephen Harper's New Conservatism. Today, he'll be speaking about his latest book, The Longer I'm Prime Minister. Tom Flanagan is a political strategist and former longtime professor in political science at the University of Calgary. He has managed leadership in election campaigns, both for the Conservative Party of Canada and the Alberta Wild Rose Party. Today, he'll be speaking about his book, Winning Power, Canadian campaigning in the 21st century. And I should actually note, I suppose maybe my own connection both to Paul. Paul and I used to write at the National Post together when it was first established in 1998. And then following that, Tom and I were actually the co-chairman for the draft Stephen Harper campaign back in 2001. And I remember Tom and I, we were both instructed to hand sign thousands of letters. You took the West, I took the East, as a way to introduce Stephen Harper to the new Conservative Party. Or I guess then it was still a Canadian Alliance. Subsequently, that became the Conservative Party. Susan Delacourt, as well, I've known for many, many years. She's a senior writer at the Toronto Star. Previously, she was a senior political writer at the National Post, a columnist and feature writer at the Ottawa Citizen, and for 16 years a parliamentary correspondent and editorial board member of the Globe and Mail. And today she'll be talking about shopping for votes, how politicians choose us and we choose them. And then finally, rounding it out, Bob Plamondon is a historian, consultant, author, and commentator on public policy and politics. Bob successfully led a campaign to change the name of the Ottawa River Parkway to the Sir John A. Macdonald Parkway in 2012. Hear, hear. He has taught at 3 universities and is the author of 4 best-selling books, including his latest, which we'll be talking about today, The Truth About Trudeau. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Paul Wells for you to kick things off. You're welcome to sit there, or you can come up here, walk around the stage, whatever you like. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thank you all for sticking around after Preston and before Mark Stein. It's a great pleasure to be on the Popular Kids panel. I think Bob's probably kosher in this room, but I'm stuck up here with the lady from the Toronto Star and the guy who's been declared persona non grata by the PMO and the guy who wouldn't stop voting for Brent Rathgaber's bill. Just to be on the safe side, I think I should warn you that to get off the stage when the session is done, I'm going to be using Lisa Sampson as a human shield. So I wrote a book about Stephen Harper. I wrote 2 books about Stephen Harper. And I should warn the people of Canada that if you elect him again, I'll write a 3rd. It's important to note that John Williamson didn't help me at all for the book. I chased him for a year and he never slowed down long enough to talk to me. So any faults in the book are mine. My goal in writing The Longer I'm Prime Minister is essentially encapsulated in the title. Prime Minister had just won his third election. He had won a majority mandate, and it was getting to be time to sum up the Harper years, not as a quirk or an accident or the damnedest thing, but as a period of Canadian history. And so I wrote this second look at Harper as Prime Minister using a different tone and a slightly different approach from the first one, which was very much an election book about the 2006 election. This one sought to explain why Stephen Harper keeps winning and why it is important to him to keep winning. So it is a book about strategy and tactics, and also about the subject's political philosophy. And I decided early that the challenge, and therefore the fun in the assignment, would be to write a book about Stephen Harper that people could like no matter where they stood on the political spectrum. It was to try and write a book about a polarizing prime minister that would appeal to a broad audience. And I was not at all sure it was possible. I was not at all sure that anyone, the Harper years in Canadian politics have been characterized, I would say, not by any kind of unprecedented level of emotion and conflict, but by a fairly steady current of emotion and conflict. And the challenge was to get my various readers, the people who are super happy that he's Prime Minister and want him to stay there for another 10 years, the people who've been working hard to stop him since the day they first became aware of his existence. I wanted to get them all to calm down long enough to see if we can come to some agreement about what's been going on in our country over the last several years. And what pleases me is that the book seems to have met some success on that front. For any further discussion of the book, we will await questions if there are any from the audience. And I can only urge you in the strongest possible terms to buy it for yourself and your friends to really understand what's going on with this book. Over to you, Tom.
Okay.
Go right ahead, yeah.
Rather stand. Well, I bring this along just to draw your attention to the striking yellow cover. It's easy to spot the book. The book, like Caesar's Gaul, is divided into three parts. The first part is a general discussion of the principles of campaigning, and I'm particularly attached to the first chapter where I bring together current work on chimpanzee politics together with Aristotle's rhetoric and Cicero's campaign for the consulate in 63 BC, and it all becomes one seamless synthesis. The second part is a discussion of current trends in Canadian campaigning over the last 10 to 15 years. And then the third part is an application of principles that come out of the first two parts. The third part is a case study of the Wild Rose campaign in Alberta in 2012, of which I was the manager. So these are the three parts. Today, I'll just say a little bit about the second part. I think that's consistent with the theme of the conference of next steps, although I'll tell you in advance I'm not going to be able to say what the next steps ought to be, because I have two serious weaknesses as an analyst. The first is that I tend to misinterpret the past, and the second is that I always fail to foretell the future. So let me just point out some of what's been happening in the last 10 to 15 years in Canadian campaigning. And all these things are interrelated. I think you'd be aware of all of these, but perhaps the interrelationships might be a new idea for you. Two things happened early in the decade. One was the merger of the Canadian Alliance with the Progressive Conservatives, which at a stroke changed the political landscape by creating a serious competitor to the Liberals for winning government, which there hadn't been for quite a while. That led to a period of minority governments. We had 3 elections in which no party was able to get a majority. And in minority government, you always have to be on a war footing, because you never know when the writ might be dropped. So you have to be prepared. And in fact, we did have 3 elections, 2004, 2006, 2008. So combine that with leadership races, and it was a period of almost constant campaigning. The second thing that happened was the infusion of a lot more money into the federal political party system. It's a great study in unintended consequence. I think they were unintended, but the Liberal government put an end to corporate and union donations to federal political parties and put a limit of $5,000 on individual contributions, and then later the Accountability Act reduced that $5,000 to $1,000. So that looked like it was reducing the influence of money in elections. But the Liberal legislation also created the subsidies or subventions, the annual payments to political parties of federal money based on the number of votes that they had had in the previous election. And even less visible, they drastically increased the size of rebates which parties get after the elections. They now get 50% back of what they have spent. So the combination of the subsidies and the rebates dramatically increased the amount of money available to political parties. The biggest winners were the Conservatives and the Bloc. The Liberals didn't lose in terms of absolute number of dollars, but in a relative sense now, the Liberals benefited less from this than anybody else. So at a time when parties are on a war footing all the time because the writ might be dropped, they suddenly have more money to spend, and particularly the Conservatives. So this led to the rise of the permanent campaign in Canada, which is a term, it's an American term, but it's now being used more and more around the world, where parties are continually on a war footing, and there's many, many aspects involved to do that, which I describe in the book. But the most visible aspect of it was pre-writ advertising. There's always been a little bit of pre-writ advertising in Canadian campaigns, but from 2004 on, it becomes a major feature. It started with the Liberals in 2004, before the writ, when they put up their website, Stephen Harper said, and ran TV and newspaper ads for about 10 days to try and drive people to the website. The Conservatives then picked up the idea of pre-writ advertising and pushed it further in 2006, 2008, 2011, and it indeed has been going on in the long run-up to the 2015 campaign. And there has been some positive pre-writ advertising, but most of it has been negative, and most of it has been an attempt to erode the credibility of the leader of your main opponent. So that's what the Liberals did in 2004, and then that's what the Conservatives did in 2006, 2008, and so on. So there's been a rise in the use of negative advertising in this particular time span in the pre-writ period. A lot of complaining about it. In my own view, there's always been a negative side to campaigns. I don't know that campaigning overall is any more negative than it used to be. It has always been. In some ways, it was more negative 100 years ago, that politicians would say things about each other then that they would never say today. But the rise of negative ads directed against leaders in the pre-writ period is a new phenomenon, and that has attracted a lot of attention. I'm sure we're going to see a lot of it in the run-up to the 2015 election, because the parties do have a lot of money. The subventions are being phased out, but they continue on a reduced scale right up into 2015. The Conservatives are rolling in money. Irving Gerstein said at the recent convention, I think they had $16 million in the bank. The other parties have enough, not as much, but they have enough to compete, I think. And the Liberals are doing better in their fundraising. So I would expect that we will see a lot of this as we move towards 2015. In the longer term, I don't know, because the recent legislation has ended the subsidies. So that will reduce the amount of money available to political parties after 2015. So I can't really predict for sure what will happen, but certainly in the run-up to 2015, the parties have lots of money, and they will have, with the rebates, they can count on having enough money to run a fully funded campaign. So I think we're going to see more of the same, certainly through 2015. We're living in the era of permanent campaign, and I think that will continue in the short run, and beyond that, my crystal ball gets kind of foggy.
You can stand or you can sit, whatever you like.
I was going to go with the journalist convention of sitting, but this, if it is true that a Toronto Star person has accidentally slipped on stage, I'm a clearer target up here. So, First of all, it's a privilege to be here. I keep telling people, one of my favorite conferences, always has been. And it's a real privilege to be with some authors whose books I much admire, especially Mr. Flanagan's Harper's Team, I think is one of the best Canadian political books written in a long time. We keep it at our side. And my only regret is that the guy who wrote the hockey book, whose name I can't remember, but you couldn't get him to appear on the panel with us. I think that's Tom's fault. All right. And also, thanks to, I see some familiar faces in the crowd. If you have questions after, you might want to pose them to the best book researcher in the world, who is also down there, Luke, whose birthday is today. All right, that's enough. The book, for those who haven't read it, is about how consumerism and shopping got mixed up with politics. And I thought it was going to be a simple book to write. I was just going to go back in time, you know, a few years. But it turned out that the more I tried to unravel this story of how we went from moving, Tom mentioned that politics is like war. He's mentioned that several times. And how we moved, though, politics from wartime metaphors and battles and troops into shopping metaphors like branding and marketing and target audiences. And I've been in Ottawa 26 years. I arrived when I was 4. And it had occurred to me that politics had changed a lot. It had really picked up on the language of the marketplace and the consumer marketplace. And when I went back through the history books, I started to realize this all started to take place after the Second World War. So the book, for those who haven't read it, starts in around the 1950s and is divided into 3 parts. The first part, which was the most fun to do, was the 1950s to the 1970s. And there really were madmen in Canadian politics then. There were places where all the ad agencies had bars, and people walked around and drank and smoked and came up with things like jingles. So all the things that were happening in the consumer world, you notice nobody has little songs anymore, but everybody had songs back then, come from, you know, a lot of the things that invaded politics in the 1950s and 1970s, market research, advertising, started with this traffic between the advertising world and the political world. And the book's cover comes from Martin Goldfarb, who went on to be Pierre Trudeau's pollster, who said that he could sell politicians like cans of tomatoes. And back when he said that, the politicians were scandalized, but I think today they would probably be okay with that. In fact, they probably wish they could be as popular as a can of tomatoes. The second part of the book is the 80s and 90s, and I called it the bargaining. It was when I think we started to have some conversations about whether we wanted to pay the price for all these innovations. Was polling really leadership? And all the things that were happening again in the consumer world, the desertion of the big brands, the rise of niche and generic markets, that all started to happen in politics too. You'd have to be as old as me to remember this, but Chrétien's first budget, he wanted it to look like a generic product from Loblaws. There was the whole idea that you made your own brand or you were a niche market. And just like the consumer and the car world blew up the brands and saw upstarts like Honda and Toyota, upstart political parties came along like the Bloc and the Reform Party, which we've talked a lot about here. And this was also the time when consumer satisfaction and product guarantees were big. Similarly, we saw recall legislation sort of get your money back on your politician. And the third part covers this century and the rise of Stephen Harper, who I call, and Patrick Moutart, his marketing manager, called the first marketing prime minister. So What I argue in the book, and the book's not a screed or a polemic, but what I argue in the book is that we are shopping all the time and politics is marketing to us all the time. So we can probably save it for the question part. My worry about this approach, the all consumer, all marketing all the time, is that we start to talk more about people's needs, what they want rather than what they need. Consumer marketing as a political trick is really good about short term, not so great about long term. And it's very hard to have a conversation about anything that doesn't have to do with consumerism. How do you get the environment on the agenda when you're getting people to shop all the time and using those metaphors? So my hope would be that we can sort of turn, I know it's very popular right now to talk about citizens as consumers, but my hope is that in the next couple of years we'll start to talk about people as both. And I look forward to your questions.
Good afternoon. I'm here today to talk about Canada's greatest Prime Minister of all time. We all know this to be Pierre Elliott Trudeau. We've heard this time after time. The CBC, in their search for Canada's greatest Canadian of all time, ranked Pierre Trudeau number 3, well ahead of, for example, Sir John A. Macdonald. And the myth about Pierre Trudeau endures to this day. We forget about the reality of Pierre Trudeau. I mean, even yesterday, we heard about the birth of another Trudeau that was on the same occasion as Pierre Trudeau's famous walk in the snow, February 28, 1984, the day before he resigned. We certainly heard about that. What we didn't hear about was that was the same day, February 28, 1984, that Iona Campagnola, then president of the Liberal Party of Canada, visited Pierre Trudeau in office to say that for the good of the party, Pierre, it was time for him to go. Now, certainly there's much to be admired about Pierre Trudeau. He was a man of intellect. He was a visionary. He was tough as nails, and he was charismatic. You know, when he was first elected Liberal leader, they said, upon becoming Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, do you intend to give up your Mercedes? To which he replied, well, which one, the car or the girl? But who he was not as important as what he did. In fact, the evidence confirms that I've reviewed is that Pierre Trudeau was the most damaging of all of our prime ministers to our economy, to our place in the world, and to our national unity. He was at his core a socialist, a man who was fascinated with communism, a man who believed in a big government and a central government. Now, as a socialist, when you are a socialist, your priority is not to grow the economy, but to attack social class. He said before becoming Prime Minister that I want a classless society. We're going to build socialism here. There is no alternative. When you are a socialist, you don't worry about national debt and public debt. He used to say, understand the country isn't ruined simply because it lends itself a bunch of money, adding that the Bank of Canada can always print money without any inconvenience when needed. Of course, maybe he was thinking that one day the upper class was going to pay the debt. When you are a socialist, you celebrate the opportunity to form partnerships with other socialists. When Pierre Trudeau was reduced to minority prime minister in 1972, in this he saw a silver lining, an opportunity to align with the New Democratic Party. In fact, he said, it allowed him to put forward more left-wing projects and to institute policies that he had been dreaming about for a very long period of time. Trudeau, we can remember, had long been associated with socialist causes in the NDP, and he said he didn't change his ideas when he went from the Liberal Party to the NDP Party. He simply went to the Liberals because he did not want to be a missionary all his life. When you're a socialist, you believe in government controls over the economy because you don't believe in free enterprise. When he introduced wage and price control, something that he famously won an election over saying he would not do, he said it was a massive intervention into the decision-making power of economic groups, telling them we haven't been able to make it work, the free enterprise system. When you're a socialist, concocting the national energy program makes sense. Not because we were facing a domestic security energy crisis, we were self-sufficient in oil, but because rising oil prices offended your sensibility, because the country, as he put it, did not have in place a system to ensure windfall gains were shared equitably. When you're a socialist, there's nothing wrong with telling people they can work 8 weeks out of the year but collect a year-round income. It was his policies that led to the creation of the unemployment insurance ski team, where at a time when the Banff Springs Hotel, for example, was looking for workers, found that there were people staying in the hotel that were collecting unemployment insurance rather than working. And it was through this socialist policy that, of course, Trudeau said that he was proud of his economic record. He said, in the case of the economy, Canada was as healthy when I left office as any of our major competitors, and probably ahead in many respects. But do we remember the record of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, where he increased the size of government in real terms by 42%? The government went from touching 17 cents out of every dollar that moved through our economy to 26 cents. He did not have, as Prime Minister, the moral compass to raise taxes to fund his so-called just society. His deficits, were they to be incurred today, would be in the order of $150 billion, and that was at a time when debt levels were relatively low and interest costs, at least when he came into office, were low. We went from having one of the lowest debt to GDP burdens among the G7 nations to one of the highest. And in fact, if you look at the budget that Minister Flaherty introduced recently, he is setting for the Government of Canada the long-term target of a debt to GDP ratio of 25%, which was precisely the debt level that Pierre Trudeau inherited from his predecessor. And what was the result? What was the result of being in perpetual stimulus mode? We saw unemployment rate in Canada rise in good times and bad under Trudeau. Whether it was from the Foreign Investment Review Agency, the National Energy Program, unemployment insurance reforms, massive creation of government programs and bureaucracies, the tragedies were not just in these statistics, but in bankruptcies, broken dreams, and broken hearts among Canadians. We may forget, for example, the misery index, which combines interest rates and unemployment, which during Trudeau's terms rose above 26 points. Today, they're in the range of 10 points. We may forget that, for example, in this area, Canada suffered with a higher misery index for 13 of the 15 years Trudeau was in office. And of course, the world looked at Canada and its economic strength, and we saw the dollar decline. 17% against the United States, 47% against the Japanese yen, 68% against the German mark. Now Trudeau, how did he represent Canada around the world? Well, he was quite happy to thumb his nose at the Americans and salute who he described Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro, saying to Canadians how much easier it would be if to run things the Cuban way. And witnessing the mass rallies for Fidel Castro and wondering what was the need for elections. Can you imagine any other G7 leader of a democratic country taking honor in having a communist dictator as a pallbearer at their funeral? Pierre Trudeau was almost always on the wrong side of history. When it comes to the Soviet Union, he went there in 1972 to say that Canada basically was under military threat from America. He told them to ignore Ronald Reagan and wait for a more reasonable leader to come around. He said that the breakup of the Soviet Union was something that we would eventually regret. Now let me conclude with his approach to nation building, our national fabric, our national unity. He did some good things, certainly I think with official bilingualism and his attempts to get a constitutional deal passed in 1971. But he did no favor for the Federalists who were fighting for hearts and minds in the province of Quebec. He did help, certainly, with the 1980 Quebec referendum, but he did so by lying to the people of Quebec and misleading them. Imagine if he said in 1980 to Quebecers that what he intended to do was to pass the Constitution, taking away the constitutional veto that Quebec had traditionally held, that he was going to intervene in areas of provincial jurisdiction, notably in education, that he was going to transfer a massive amount of power away from elected officials and into the hands of the Supreme Court, which he did with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Had he said those things in 1980, I imagine that people of Quebec would not have been too happy. In fact, Federalists in Quebec, such as his colleague Jean Sauvé and Jean Marchand, referred to Trudeau as either a traitor or astonishment at what he had done. Even Jean Chrétien said it was one of the saddest days in his political life to see Quebec so isolated. So what do we say about Pierre Trudeau, about the damage that was done? We can certainly remember him for his personal qualities and for some of the good things he did, but overall I think there was no Prime Minister who was no more damaging to the Canadian fabric than Pierre Trudeau. And as David Frum likes to say, we must never excuse and never forget. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I should say I'd be remiss if I didn't encourage you all to afterwards go outside and purchase one of the, where all the authors, the books here that the authors have written. I have 3 of the 4, and I'm going to pick up the 4th one I don't. If we want good books to be written about Canadian politics, it's important to support those authors. On top of that, you've got the added benefit of at least the 3 that I have. They're all good books, and I'm sure the 4th one is as well. So I'd encourage you to do that. I trust that authors will be there to sign their books as well. Is that correct? Yeah. So please, I'd encourage you to do that. I've got actually 2 questions, and then I'll turn things over to the audience. The first question is for Paul and for Tom, and that is, given and the question will be similar, given what you both know, your kind of insight of the Prime Minister, what do you think his challenges in the next election campaign? I, of course, am a first-term member, and I want what every first-term member wants, which is a second term. So I have a kind of an interest in I suppose, getting a sense of what you think, and particularly given that one of the mistakes I think that politicians often make or political parties make is we tend to fight the next campaign based on what we know from the last campaign, and that can, of course, change rapidly. So if you could...
What Stephen Harper is trying to do, let us assume, and I think it's a fairly safe assumption that he plans to lead the Conservative Party into the next election. What he'll be seeking to do then is hard. He'll have been Prime Minister for 9 years. The only Prime Ministers who've been Prime Minister longer than 10 years, there's Trudeau, there's Laurier, there's MacDonald, and of course there's King. He'd be getting up into very rare territory. He would be seeking to win a 4th consecutive election. The last party leader to win 4 elections in a row was Wilfred Laurier. And he has been trailing in the polls for close to a year. His challenge is to find the Stephen Harper who won the 2006 election and then built his share of the popular vote in the elections that followed. He did that by reaching out in surprising ways to natural enemies, the Progressive Conservative Party in the first instance, Quebec nationalism after that, and by appearing as a guy who, obviously with very strong convictions and not particularly interested in being cuddly, but as somebody who could think of and want to govern for all Canadians. I think conferences like this one are handy for reminding the Prime Minister that his gut reaction is not always the reaction that works best for him. He does have, since I'm playing baseball statistician here with my fancy numbers, he does have a huge advantage, which is that he'll be the only national leader, except for Elizabeth May at the next election, who's done this before. Running a national campaign is complex, it's full of surprises, and it usually sucks. And one thing you have to learn is that today's lousy headline is not the end of your career if you don't let it. And it is extremely rare for a rookie party leader to beat an experienced incumbent who has some practice at winning. The last guy who did that was Joe Clark. And I will end by saying that the only party leaders, the only rookies who beat veteran winning incumbents, Alexander Mackenzie, Joe Clark, and I believe R.B. Bennett, ended up being defeated by the wily old veteran that they had knocked off in the first instance. Trudeau came back, Sir John A. Macdonald came back. So, going far out on a limb of supposition, if by any chance a rookie party leader manages to beat Harper-led Conservative government in the next election, the best leader for the Conservatives in the election after that is Stephen Harper.
You do want to write that next book, don't you? One way or the other. Tom, you've got some unique perspective on this, and I think given now that you're observing things from outside of the party, what are your views on the best way to fight that next campaign if you're in the Conservative war room?
Well, I agree with Paul that going back to the Harper of 2006, as he appeared to people then, would be a big help. Since winning the majority government, events and actions have projected certain sides of his character, and deeply entrenched them in popular perceptions. And he's a man of multiple facets, but he's been appearing as, overly partisan, devious, secretive, and vindictive. And it's hard to win when that's the way people perceive you, particularly when your main opponent is somebody who seems like a genuinely nice man, even if somewhat scatterbrained perhaps, but he seems non-threatening as long as you don't listen to what he's saying. So I think, but this is not easy, having projected himself in a certain way over the last couple of years, and the Senate controversy certainly put the finish on it. How he goes back to what he was in 2006, I don't know.
And can I ask you, because I think I've heard you talk about this, like, is that, you've talked about the ads not working, for example, on Mr. Trudeau in a more policy-oriented. What do you think the prescription, because in the past, whether it was Ignatieff or Dion, that was a campaign for success, and now you seem to be indicating that maybe not this time around.
That's right. Well, thus far, Justin has proven to be extremely difficult to attack in the same way that attacks were successful against Dion and Ignatieff. The Liberal Convention provides new material. It would be kind of like the way that the Liberals attacked the Harper hidden agenda.
Right.
You could attack the Trudeau as, in terms of the Liberal Party, and keep asking him what is your stance on these on the huge bouquet of policies that they put forward. Whether that would work, I don't know, but it is another alternative. Also, of course, there is the policy route that the government has a chance now with the next budget to lay the table for policies that voters may find attractive. But the root of the Conservative problem is not really policy. It's actually quite amazing that they have managed in the majority government period to administer some fairly tough medicine to government without creating any big outcry about it. It's gone down pretty well without a whole lot of sugar. So I don't think the problem is policy. I think new attractive policies for the campaign will certainly help. But the big problem they face at the moment is the perceived hyper-partisanship of the Prime Minister and different characteristics that go along with that. So if he could, go back and recover the other side of his character, which is just as real as what people think they see now, that would help a whole lot.
All right. Well, thank you. And Susan, Bob, Susan, I know in your book you kind of decry the state we're in with the marketed, the packaged approach we have towards messaging. But I'm curious, nonetheless, if you could kind of also, in terms of where we're going, how you see the different campaigns being run, the Conservative, the Liberal, and the NDP. And then, Bob, right afterwards, if you would just talk about if your book kind of holds any kind of any wisdom for the next campaign. I suppose particularly in Quebec, the Liberals haven't won a majority of the Quebec vote since 1980. Is Mr. Trudeau, is Trudeau this going to be able to succeed where other Liberal leaders haven't since 1980? So Susan, over to you first, please.
Okay. I was going to start answering Bob's question.
you can.
No, I'll stick with my own. What I lay out in the book is that definitely the Conservatives are the masters of marketing and seeing the world through the eyes of what has become a very winning formula. And it's thanks to people like Tom who set up the databases and early. The Conservatives and New Democrats, for the past 2 or 3 elections, have been far superior than the Liberals at organization, at targeting the electorate. The Liberals are in a furious game of catch-up. This morning, I got an email, I guess it's congratulate Justin on the birth of the baby, and what that is a huge data grab, right? And as a colleague was pointing out, the Conservatives did this a few years ago with congratulate Loreen on Mother's Day, and it's all a way of getting data. So that's where I think we're headed now into the next campaign, is a data campaign. But a few months ago, I moderated a really interesting discussion between Obama's digital strategists. There's a hilarious war going on at the moment, by the way, between the Liberals and the New Democrats to see who can claim to be the best friends of Obama. I think they're appearing, they've sort of divided up Obama's strategists to go to both conventions. But the Obama strategists were saying that the Republicans started all this data stuff and marketing, but the reason the Democrats became better at it is because the Democrats brought in the social scientists. That the consumer marketing only worked so far, and then when they started to look at behavioral science, surprise, surprise, politics is about relationships and people. And so the real resources and the real concentration of efforts now is Facebook or people's friends, trying to figure out where your neighbors and your, the communities that you travel in influence your vote. And the reason the Democrats were so good at this, they said, was because they had a message and a leader that was consistent with empowering individuals. That this kind of technology now that is in the hands of all the political parties, it puts a lot of power in the hands of the individual. You can influence a whole election campaign with a tweet. So if you don't have a party leader and a party message that's consistent with empowering the individual, believing in people, wanting to organize people, seeming like you're using politics about relationships, you may be in trouble, which is, as Tom has pointed out, the interesting challenge for the Conservatives going into the next election. The public image of the party that seems to be settling in, or at least the leadership of the party, is one that doesn't seem like it trusts individuals all that much. And in a very data-driven, relationship-driven kind of politics, that's not a good message to have.
Interesting. Actually, on that, I did a household survey recently on Trudeau's pot plan, which caused me all kinds of accusations that I was fear-mongering. But I actually went back and looked at some video of Trudeau on talking about his pot plan, and he actually cast it in the barrel of personal liberty, which I thought was really interesting. I hadn't actually expected that, and I thought that was an interesting way to kind of reach out to that voter pool.
Jerry Butts, I think, said it on Question Period 2 weeks ago that the Liberals were in the midst of the effort to get the word freedom back.
Interesting.
That word used to belong to the Liberals, yeah, and they've let Conservatives steal it.
Very good. Bob?
So you were asking about Justin's political prospects, and it's pretty clear. I mean, my book is about Pierre Trudeau, but yes, it's pretty clear that if it was Justin Laurier and he wasn't building on the legacy, the celebrity, the curiosity, and even the myth of his father, he would not be today leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. But it's a dangerous thing, I think, to be trading off on his father's legacy for a couple of reasons. First off, we forget that outside of 1968, Pierre Trudeau lost every single election he fought outside of the province of Quebec, and he lost them badly, to Joe Clark and to Bob Stanfield by a margin of 2-1. And when you look back, for example, in 1980, the Liberals won 2 of 77 seats west of the Ontario border. The only reason that Pierre Trudeau held power for 4 or 5 election campaigns is that his absolute dominance in the province of Quebec. And why wouldn't they support him in Quebec? He brought in official bilingualism, he was spreading the cash around, he was appointing Quebecers to positions in high office, he was a native son, so there was a good reason to support Pierre Trudeau. But he never faced the electors of Quebec after patriating the Constitution over the government of Quebec. And the name Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau, outside of the island of Montreal in Quebec has been a very difficult one to sustain since 1984. So I do see Justin perhaps regaining some support for Liberals in and around the island of Montreal, particularly in ridings where there's a strong Anglophone community, but I don't think that translates across the province of Quebec. Trudeau Justin has a lot to overcome in the West. Certainly the National Energy Program resonates to this very day. And if I was giving advice to Justin Trudeau, which I'm not, he hasn't really asked, my advice to him would be this. Don't even mention your father in campaigning, not one bit, except to the extent perhaps that you disagreed with your father. I think he needs to stand on his own 2 feet. And if he stood up, for example, and to say, you know, I love my father, but he was wrong on the economy, he was wrong on deficit spending, he was wrong to rack up the debt, he was wrong with a lot of his temporary make-work programs, he was wrong on the environment, he was wrong on immigration. He did some good things, and that's fine. But if he stood up and said, you know, perhaps Jack Layton didn't need to do this about his father, Bob Layton, who had served in Brian Mulroney's cabinet. But I think people would stand up and take notice. The same way he, you know, when he had a public meeting, I think it was in Prescott and Russell, and he criticized the Liberal Party for their policy on the gun registry. All of a sudden people stopped and said, well, maybe, you know, this is his own man. So I think, in a way, he used his family legacy to get the leadership, and in a way he should jettison it if he wants to be successful nationally, politically.
Very good. Look, I only have a few minutes left. Are there any questions, actually? Anyone want to go to the mic? And Monty, are you going to the mic to ask a question? No? Okay.
Bye, Monty.
This one work?
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Cole Hogan, and I'm from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. I just wanted to ask a quick question in particular to Mr. Wells, but the whole panel can feel free to discuss it, of course. You've written about the process of buying change under Prime Minister Martin and Chrétien, and sort of federal healthcare transfers with strings attached. And with open federalism, that's gone completely. And with Section 92 of the Constitution, it just makes sense. So in Saskatchewan, where I'm from, former Premier Roy Romano said that without having the federal government involved in provincial healthcare transfers, that, you know, sort of it would be a threat to national unity. But Canada's still here. So my question is, what do you think will be the long-term effects of open federalism, both politically and nationally?
I've now been writing about politics long enough that I've learned that some things you thought were eternal actually aren't necessarily. And one of them is the practice of executive federalism that I studied as an undergraduate, and that was such a fixture of federal politics when I arrived in Ottawa that in the old Montreal Gazette office there was the Charlottetown sofa. It was the sofa that they had purchased because there were round-the-clock federal provincial meetings at the Langevin block, and the Gazette reporters had to be able to steal back into the office and have a nap from 3 to 5 a.m. so that they could be back to hear Norman Spector at 5:30 a.m. Something I remind myself whenever I think that I have it hard in life. That was the obligatory dig at Norman. Stephen Harper has had fewer federal provincial conferences than any prime minister since before King, I believe. The institution of getting together to discuss the nature in which all Canadians will be governed at the highest level between constitutionally equal prime minister and premiers is just gone. Instead, he's given them a bunch of money and said, don't bug me. I think that is at least as interesting a way to do things as constant hand-holding, and it has obvious weaknesses, just as the other version has obvious weaknesses. There tends to be a little sort of desynchronization. We were getting to the point under Chrétien and Martin where I, as a citizen moving from one province to the other, could hope to get some minimal information about the results that my home province's healthcare system got that I could compare to my target province's healthcare system because the feds were enforcing comparable healthcare indicators. That's gone away. And I think that is a cost to be paid. But the just sort of endless psychodrama that was a central feature, especially of Paul Martin's federalism, is also gone away. One of my surprises is that as Ottawa seeks to govern the provinces less, the provinces have done not nearly as much intergovernmentalism to compensate as I would have expected. Instead, everyone just does what they want. my deep secret when the Liberals were in power and my own boss was outing me in public as a Chrétien Liberal was that I had very little patience for Chrétien's federalism, and I have more patience for Harper's federalism than a lot of people might suspect. And I'm quite happy not to have to use the Charlottetown sofa in the daily conduct of my business.
Very good. Any other comment for anyone else? No. I'll take one more question if there's someone at the mic, and then we'll probably wrap it up. No. Yes.
There we go.
No one else will step up. Several of you have talked about campaigns, and we've kind of seen ourselves in a constant campaign from minority government into majority government. How important is the next campaign? And is the pre-writ period as important, more important, less important than the actual writ period will be this time around, just given everything that you know about our current context?
Yeah.
You know, go ahead, Susan, yes?
Yes, hugely important. The reason that the Conservatives have done so well in the past few election campaigns is that they've already done the campaign before the campaign starts. The Liberals had this quaint notion that they would go out and start identifying vote the day the writ dropped, which is an antique practice now. Now, as we know, advertising, campaigning, identifying the vote, communicating with your voters, all happens before that writ is dropped. And the Liberals' campaign manager, Katie Telford, has done a little video available to everybody saying the campaign has started. The New Democrats are acting as though the campaign has started. So I would say that we now live in the permanent campaign. I think we need laws, by the way, to cover that. I think we need stronger advertising, fundraising, and all those other kind of laws to acknowledge that reality, but I think I'm in the minority on that right now.
I think, one of the big changes, and this is to the advantage of the opposition parties in particular, is the fixed election date. Whereas before, the government always had within its toolkit the right to call an election essentially at any time. So they'd have the heads up, they would know, when and how to prepare for a campaign. Now the opposition parties essentially have that same advantage. So when Justin Trudeau was thinking about developing his platform, he has short of some parliamentary crisis and the Prime Minister dropping the writ ahead of time, they can plan much more effectively for the period between now and the next election period. They can organize themselves, they can fundraise, they know when they're going to spend money and when they're not going to spend money. And the campaigns have their different phases. They're perpetual, but they have different things that they're emphasizing at different points in time. So, like in the States, it's not much more than a few weeks after the last campaign when you're thinking about who's going to be the candidate next time and how to prepare for the next election. That really is our new reality in Canada.
Thank you. And Tom, any final words?
Yeah, well, certainly the voter identification has become virtually permanent activity, and so it's really important to do as much as you can before the writ is dropped. On the other hand, you can't finish the job before the writ is dropped because a lot of people aren't paying much attention. So IDs that you get before the writ is dropped do need to be reconfirmed during the writ period, at least for your marginal voters. But the pre-writ activity is extremely important. Now, I would say that in 2008 and 2011, those campaigns were really won in the pre-writ period. The ethos of or image, credibility, whatever you want to call it, of the Liberal leaders was so badly damaged by unanswered negative ads in the pre-writ period that the Conservatives went into both campaigns with big leads. The Liberals, there was movement in the campaign too, but the Conservatives came in with large leads based on their pre-writ advertising. I imagine they're going to try and do that again. Whether it will have the same effect this time, we see Justin is a harder target. So you're certainly going to see the effort, I believe, of whether the impact of it will be the same. Conservatives were behind about 6 points in 2006 when the writ was dropped. Pre-writ advertising was not a factor in that campaign, and a combination of tactics and some events in the campaign allowed the Conservatives to move ahead in that campaign. So it's not like there are natural laws here that it's always the same. Each campaign is unique. So all you can say is that the pre-writ campaign is now a major part of the whole thing. We used to have a kind of a cyclical understanding of campaigns in which that was something that happened every 4 years, and the party leader would appoint a campaign committee about a year ahead to develop a platform and get some organization and so forth, and then everybody would go home after the campaign and take a rest for another 3 years. But it's not, and now it is an ongoing activity. It's like the marketing department of a corporation. It never stops. But that's not to say that the campaign period itself is unimportant. There's still an excitement of the campaign period that can bring about completely unforeseen changes.
Obviously, the pre-writ campaign matters. My rule of thumb is that anyone who expects the campaign to start later is in trouble. I've seen that. I saw that when John Manley thought he could look forward to one day beginning to campaign for the federal Liberal leadership. He was already toast. A succession of Liberal leaders who can't wait for the campaign to begin while they get campaigned to death. This is an odd pre-writ. There's a few things happening. The Conservative movement in general in the country is freaking itself out over Justin Trudeau to an extent that should cause some introspection. It reminds me of the weird convention the Liberals had in this building in 2012, right after the election, when Peter C. Newman had written a book declaring the Liberal Party was dead, and you couldn't get a Liberal go to the microphone without a sort of a pro forma exorcism of Peter C. Newman. You know, we'll prove Peter C. Newman wrong, they said, reminding people of Peter C. Newman's book at every turn. So that's one thing, and the extended commercial radio ad campaign against Justin Trudeau, predicated on the notion that parents should be afraid of his marijuana policies, has not been a big success. Secondly, the Conservatives are ignoring Tom Mulcair and the NDP. He is by every sort of standard index an at least comparably formidable opponent. And finally, each period in our recent Canadian history has been what the Conservatives have used to advertise as an advertisement for what they're proposing next. Paul Martin was a great advertisement for Stephen Harper. The Coalition was a great advertisement for a majority Conservative government. To what extent has the period since 2011 been an advertisement for handing the Conservatives a second majority? That also is a question that Conservatives need to urgently ask themselves.
Well, thank you. That wraps up this session. Again, I want to thank Bob, Susan, Tom, and Paul for being with us here today.